during a flight. A black pastor was asked to remove his cross. Rather than reacting with anger, he rose and shared a message that captivated everyone. It was a pleasant Friday morning in late April when Pastor Elijah Rowe entered Raleigh-Durham International Airport through the sliding glass doors, pulling a small black carry-on behind him. He wasn't hurried, never was. At 58 years old, Elijah possessed the composed demeanor of someone who understood that serenity wasn't achieved through haste. His flight to Albuquerque was planned with a connection in Kansas City, and Flight 287 would transport him through the initial segment. He was wearing a light cream linen shirt, dark slacks, and worn brown shoes that had been present at numerous potluck dinners and hospital rooms beyond measure. However, what distinguished him wasn't his attire. It was the small wooden cross resting softly against his chest. It wasn't ostentatious or large. No gold, no diamonds, simply a piece of carved wood. The edges softened by years of use. His grandmother had given it to him when he was 18, shortly before her passing. "Wear it when the world forgets who you are," she told him. He hadn't taken off since. At gate C-21, Elijah located a quiet corner seat and retrieved a notepad. He didn't prepare his sermons on a laptop. He favored paper, appreciating the sound of pen against page. This week's message concerned forgiveness, once more. He quietly chuckled to himself. "It feels as though I'm meant to continue sharing what I'm still discovering," he murmured, taking a sip of lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. The boarding call came promptly. He rose, offered a pleasant good morning to the gate agent, and proceeded down the jet bridge. He gave a brief acknowledgement to the flight attendant stationed by the door. A tall woman with a formal demeanor and a precise tone. "Seat 22, Elijah spoke quietly to himself as he walked down the aisle. A young man was already settled into 22B, wearing headphones and a hoodie. Elijah offered a polite smile and took a seat by the window. The boy didn't acknowledge him. That was acceptable. Elijah didn't require conversation to feel at ease. He positioned the cross against his shirt and continued writing in his notebook. After 15 minutes, the cabin door closed. The aircraft began to pull away from the gate. The standard announcements were made, followed by the familiar, somewhat jarring sound as the plane accelerated down the runway. Elijah murmured a brief prayer as the plane ascended into the sky. He was halfway through his outline on Luke 6 when a voice broke his concentration. "Sir," a woman's voice said from the aisle. "Sir, excuse me." Elijah looked up to see the same tall flight attendant from earlier, standing beside him. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes gentle. She did not smile. "Could you please tuck your necklace into your shirt?" Elijah blinked. "My cross." She nodded. "We've received some complaints." He looked around, surprised. "From whom?" She replied quickly, "I can't disclose that. We simply request that passengers be considerate of items that may cause discomfort to others." He studied her face for a moment. There was no warmth in it, no opportunity for discussion. "I'm sorry," Elijah said slowly, "but this necklace isn't a display. It's my faith. It was my grandmother's." "Sir, I'm not attempting to argue with you," she said, her voice tightening. "I'm requesting that you please comply with a straightforward request so we can avoid any additional issues." "Is this an airline policy?" Her lips formed a thin line. "I need your cooperation," she stated. The young man in 22B adjusted his hoodie and looked at Elijah, then averted his gaze. Elijah kept his hands still on his notebook. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his tone even quieter this time. "But I won't be hiding it." The flight attendant released a breath through her nose, appearing visibly annoyed. "I'll be back," she said, and then turned and left. Elijah leaned back in his seat and looked out the window. Below them, the clouds spread out, a vast expanse of brilliant white. He touched the cross carefully, his thumb tracing the worn rim. This feeling wasn't unfamiliar, not precisely. Yet it felt altered, as if something had changed, though he couldn't yet identify what. The flight continued, and so did their discussion. The drink cart was 2 rows behind when she returned, without a smile, without warmth. She maintained the same rigid posture and that precise, formal tone, making each word feel like a protocol rather than an exchange. "Sir," she repeated, standing before Elijah's row, her arms now crossed. "I must ask you once more to secure the necklace." A woman, 2 rows above, expressed that she finds it objectionable. Elijah didn't reply immediately. He observed her intently. Her name tag indicated C. Densmore. Her uniform was immaculate, with not a single thread amiss. She repeatedly looked at the other passengers, seemingly searching for support or an observer. He focused his gaze forward. In row 20, a woman wearing a blue blazer and large sunglasses remained fixedly ahead. She didn't look back, didn't move restlessly, simply waited. "I understand what you're saying," Elijah responded steadily. "But I am innocent. I haven't spoken to anyone. I'm simply sitting here quietly. Why is this necklace causing a problem?" Claire Densmore's jaw tightened. "This isn't concerning your silence. It's important to be thoughtful. If someone finds something you're wearing upsetting, it's fair to ask you to modify it," Elijah stated calmly. "If someone is offended by my faith, I don't believe that gives them the right to suppress it." At that point, her tone changed. A hint of her composure faded. "You're being uncooperative," she said, her voice rising. "I am asking you respectfully, but you are being confrontational," and several heads turned. A woman situated 2 rows back extended into the aisle, observing. A man seated across from Elijah shifted his position to gain a clearer view. Elijah's pulse quickened, though his expression remained unchanged. He glanced toward the young man in 22B. The kid had retrieved his phone, subtly, not overtly. Screen angled upwards, thumb poised above the record button. "I'm not trying to provoke anyone," Elijah said, speaking deliberately. "But I won't conceal my cross. I won't take it away to accommodate another person's ease. I apologize." Claire expressed her disapproval. "Then we may have to escalate this," she stated firmly. "You're refusing to follow a directive from a flight crew member. That's a federal offense," someone exclaimed. "Are you serious?" Another voice inquired from a few rows back. A middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard leaned into the aisle. "He's literally just sitting there," he observed. Claire disregarded him. "I'm going to inform the captain," she declared, maintaining eye contact with Elijah. "We'll handle this when we land." "Of course," Elijah responded. She turned and walked away again, this time with a quicker pace, speaking quietly to another flight attendant as she moved past the drink cart. The ensuing silence felt heavy. Elijah remained still in his seat, his pen still held between his fingers. The pages of his sermon notes shifted gently in the airflow from the overhead vent. Then a quiet voice emerged. "Sir," the boy beside him whispered, almost lost in the plane's hum. "I'm recording, just so you know, in case they attempt anything." Elijah slowly turned his head and offered the boy a thankful nod. "Thank you," he said softly. "I saw everything," the boy added. "She's way out of line," Elijah smiled slightly. "Sometimes it's not about the cross. It's about the person wearing it." The boy remained silent, but glanced down at his phone, which was still recording. 3 rows back, an older black woman whispered something to the person beside her. Her gaze met Elijah's for a brief moment. She offered him a subtle nod, as if acknowledging his presence and understanding his situation. That gesture carried weight. The intercom buzzed, and another attendant, not Claire, delivered a brief announcement regarding anticipated light turbulence. Standard procedure. However, the atmosphere on the plane had changed noticeably. Passengers were no longer solely focused on sleeping or entertainment. They were alert and observant. It wasn't the sort of attention Elijah desired, but his perspective had become secondary. Before the plane could land, an unexpected event occurred, one that even Elijah hadn't anticipated. By the time the plane stabilized after the turbulence warning, Claire Densmore returned to the aisle, but she was accompanied by another flight attendant. He was a younger man with dark hair and visibly nervous eyes. His name tag identified him as Jonas Worth, and unlike Claire, he lacked confidence in his demeanor. His steps were hesitant, appearing almost apologetic. "Mr. Rowe," Claire began, ensuring her voice carried to a significant portion of the cabin. "I've spoken with the captain. If you persist in disregarding crew instructions, we might need to take additional measures upon arrival." Elijah remained unperturbed. I would still appreciate knowing which policy I'm in violation of. You're becoming argumentative once more, Claire retorted. Jonas moved closer, observing the interaction. Perhaps we could simply... Claire interrupted him. Jonas, I'm managing this. And then it reappeared, that palpable tension, that familiar tone. Elijah stayed seated, outwardly calm, though his heart raced. Behind them, row 19 began to move. I don't see why he should be made to conceal his cross, a woman with curly red hair and a noticeable Wisconsin accent stated. I wear a Star of David necklace on every flight. I've never been addressed about it. Claire turned quickly. Ma'am, I am requesting you refrain from intervening. The woman responded, I'm not interfering. I'm simply observing that this feels like he's being unfairly targeted. At that moment, something changed noticeably. The atmosphere shifted. Passengers were no longer simply observing, but responding. A gentleman in seat 18D craned his neck. Is this truly how this airline handles situations? He inquired. I'm recording as well, and I understand how swiftly videos spread online. Claire appeared taken aback. She started to speak, then hesitated and closed her mouth. Elijah, Jonas said quietly, intervening and lowering his tone. Sir, I apologize truly. You've been entirely respectful. I believe we should reduce the tension. Let's allow this to pass. Claire's cheeks reddened. She looked at Jonas as if he had committed a betrayal. Then, with a visible effort to control herself, she hissed. He's disregarding a direct order. To do what? Elijah asked, maintaining his composure. To conceal a portion of myself that I've carried for 40 years? That doesn't seem correct to me, ma'am. Claire's jaw tightened again. I am finished. She turned and walked forcefully toward the front of the plane, her shoulders stiff with anger. Jonas remained behind, feeling unsure. I apologize for all of this, he said softly to Elijah. I believe she misinterpreted the circumstances, she responded. I think she understood perfectly, Elijah said calmly. She simply didn't approve of what she observed. Jonas lowered his gaze, then looked away. The cabin stabilized, but a feeling of unease lingered. Passengers murmured along the aisle, with some visibly shaking their heads. A cough broke the silence. The boy in 22B continued filming. Then Elijah took an unexpected action. He rose to his feet. Without raising his voice or gesturing, he stood in the confined area near his seat and angled himself so those in the surrounding rows could hear. I don't often speak in public spaces such as this, he began, his voice steady but quiet. But I believe it's important to say something. One by one, people turned to look at him. I'm a pastor, he continued. I serve a small church in Durham. This cross, he raised it carefully between his fingers, was a gift from my grandmother. She experienced events that many of us only read about. She advised me to wear this when the world attempted to define me. A brief silence followed. I have not removed it since her funeral. My reason isn't that I believe it improves me, but that it serves as a reminder to remain compassionate. Even when I am not shown kindness, a person in 24C covered their mouth. Another individual in 20F audibly sniffled. I understand not everyone shares my beliefs. I acknowledge and respect that, but I am certain I have acted appropriately. I remained still, adhered to every guideline, and attempted to be courteous, even when I felt diminished. He addressed Jonas directly. I do not require being asked to leave this flight. I pose no danger. I am merely a man traveling home to deliver a sermon on forgiveness on Sunday. The atmosphere on the plane was subdued, yet sometimes silence conveys more than words ever could, and the quietness wasn't going to last much longer. Claire had not reappeared since she departed. The whereabouts of Eleanor remained uncertain, whether she was in the galley, visibly upset, or once again speaking with the captain. It was unclear. However, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't just one person standing. Instead, a sense of reality had permeated the space, manifesting in every hushed exchange and fleeting look shared among those seated within 30 rows. Elijah quietly resumed his seat, as if finishing a chapter in a novel. He sought no accolades and craved no validation. He simply released a breath. The young man next to him ceased recording, though he kept his phone in hand. "You sure you're pastor?" he inquired softly, a slight smirk playing on his lips. Elijah laughed. "Some Sundays I question it myself," he admitted. The young man chuckled and glanced at his phone screen. "That's already being shared. People need to hear things like that." A few minutes elapsed. Following that, the woman in the blue blazer, the one Claire had mentioned complained about, gradually turned from 2 rows forward. Her sunglasses were now removed. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, with a tense expression, yet there was a gentleness about her. I remained silent. She spoke in a matter-of-fact tone. Elijah lifted his eyebrows. "Mom, I never said I was upset. I didn't mention your necklace." The atmosphere became quiet once more. Several passengers who had been listening seemed interested. "She simply inquired if I was all right," the woman added, and I replied that I hadn't observed anything. "Are you suggesting Claire wasn't truthful?" Someone murmured behind Elijah. The woman in the blazer remained silent. She pivoted, appearing somewhat less confident. Jonas emerged from the front of the plane. His shirt now had a slight wrinkle, as if he's been twisting his hands. He stopped near Elijah's row and bent down a little, speaking quietly. "The captain is aware," he said. "And just so you know, you're not in any trouble. We're not removing you. There's no written reprimand." "Nothing." Elijah nodded. "Thank you for letting me know." Jonas expressed regret that things hadn't unfolded differently, noting that occasionally individuals carry emotional burdens that extend beyond physical luggage. Elijah offered a subtle smile in agreement, commenting that this phenomenon is evident in various settings, not just airplanes. Jonas paused, then continued, "I'm not sure if this is inappropriate, but would you be comfortable with me attending your church sometime? I used to go when I was younger, but it's been a long time." Elijah's smile widened. "Certainly. Please do. I'll be sure to reserve a place for you." Jonas gently touched the armrest before departing. As he moved back up the aisle, a woman seated opposite Elijah bent forward. "Pastor," she murmured, "thank you." He observed her. She appeared older, possibly in her 70s. A long green scarf adorned her, and her hands rested in her lap, as if guarding something delicate. "You didn't need to speak," she said, "but you did." "Sometimes silence can feel heavier than a voice," Elijah replied. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "That is precisely it." The boy beside Elijah nudged him gently. Elijah gazed out the window. "Let's just hope I'm preaching the same on Sunday as I'm living right now," he thought. A woman with curly hair, whom he's seen before, spoke from behind. "I think the Lord already gave you your sermon, Pastor," she said. "You just preached it at 35,000 feet. Laughter rippled through the cabin, soft, sincere, and welcome. Conversations started again, moving beyond quiet murmurs. A sense of energy and relief filled the cabin, as if it had expelled something it had been containing. However, Claire was still missing. But when she ultimately returned, she would not be alone, and she would not anticipate what awaited her. Approximately 40 minutes had passed since Claire's disappearance. It was believed she would remain missing until the landing. Yet, just as the seatbelt sign illuminated once more, she reappeared, accompanied by the captain himself. Captain Raymond Stills was in his mid-40s, gray hair buzzed close, weathered skin from years in cockpits. He didn't appear angry. He didn't appear rushed. But there was something in his face, an alert stillness, like someone who had seen far worse and didn't want to make a situation worse than it already was. He stopped beside Elijah's row and crouched slightly, just as Jonas had. "Sir," he said in a low, calm voice, "my name's Ray. I understand there's been some tension on board." Elijah met his gaze directly. "Captain," I remained silent. "This cross I'm wearing appeared to cause concern for a flight attendant. She requested that I conceal it. I declined." Ray observed the necklace, then noted Elijah's composed demeanor. "I appreciate your manner," the captain said. "It's more significant than you realize these days." Claire stood rigidly behind him, her arms crossed. Those seated around appeared to be ignoring the situation, yet no one was wearing headphones. All were attentively listening. "I've spoken with my crew," Ray said, "and I've reviewed the footage. Several passengers had documented portions of the interaction, including the young man seated nearby. Elijah briefly looked at the teenager, who offered a subtle nod, still clutching his phone as if it were a barrier. Ray rose and surveyed the adjacent rows. "I want to be clear," he stated, his voice now more pronounced. "This airline has no rule against religious symbols, be it a cross, a hijab, a yarmulke, or another item. Passengers may express their beliefs provided they do so respectfully. Based on observations, Pastor Rowe has been acting in that manner, prompting nods and applause from several people." Quiet, polite, and without drama, Ray addressed Claire. "We're going to have a more in-depth conversation after we land." Claire offered no reply. Her expression remained unreadable, but her jaw was tense. She turned and walked back toward the galley without another word. Ray leaned toward Elijah. "You're not in trouble. You never were. I apologize on behalf of the crew." "You don't have to," Elijah replied, "but I appreciate it." Ray offered a small smile. "Well, some things are still worth saying." And with that, he returned to the cockpit. Jonas reappeared moments later and quietly offered Elijah a free drink and snack box. "Captain's orders," he said sheepishly. "You deserve at least that," Elijah chuckled. "I'll take the almonds." As the plane began its descent into Kansas City, a different feeling settled over the cabin. People were chatting again, not nervously but openly. Two men who hadn't spoken the whole flight were now exchanging church stories. A young woman pulled out her Bible and started highlighting verses. A toddler across the aisle waved at Elijah, and his mother mouthed, "Thank you." Elijah simply sat back and completed his sermon notes. He wrote, "Forgiveness, but not silence." The older woman in green across the aisle retrieved a pen and wrote something on a napkin, then passed it to Elijah. He unfolded it and read, "You reminded us how to carry grace." "Thank you." He folded the napkin and placed it into his notebook. The plane began its final descent, but there was a quiet sense of closure. It felt as though something had broken and then repaired itself, if only a little. Unbeknownst to Elijah, the event wasn't concluded. The world beyond that plane had already taken notice. Flight 287 landed in Kansas City just after 4:20 p.m. The tires made a soft thumping sound as they touched the runway. The standard chime occurred. Passengers unfastened their seatbelts. The overhead compartments released with a click. Yet, a peculiar stillness permeated the movement, as if no one wished to be the first to disrupt the significance of what had transpired in the air. As the plane taxied toward the gate, a flight attendant, someone other than Claire, announced over the intercom. Her voice sounded nervous, almost shaky. She expressed gratitude for everyone flying with them that day. For those continuing their journey to Albuquerque, boarding would resume shortly after a brief pause. Elijah waited patiently. He consistently prioritized allowing others to disembark first. He remained seated with his hands resting on his notebook, his cross still noticeable as the aisle emptied. When he eventually stood to collect his bag, Jonas greeted him at the plane's front. "Sir," he stated, "there are 2 airport officers just outside the jet bridge. They're not here for you. They simply want to speak briefly with the crew and take a statement." Elijah raised an eyebrow. Was someone pressing charges? "No," they replied, but once the footage started spreading, someone tagged airport security, then a few others. "I suppose people are watching." Elijah stepped off the plane and into the fluorescent-lit walkway. 2 officers stood to the side, but neither approached him. They spoke softly with a woman holding a clipboard, presumably a gate supervisor. Jonas acknowledged him with a nod and returned to the aircraft. Inside the terminal, Elijah located a quiet seat near the window. He retrieved his phone for the first time in hours, revealing 30 new messages, missed calls, and a voicemail from his assistant at the church. However, a notification at the top of the screen caught his attention. A video had gone viral. It was the recording from the teen in seat 22B, now shared on TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. The caption stated, "Flight attendant attempts to embarrass pastor for wearing a cross." See his response. It had over 800,000 views and was increasing. Elijah watched only a few seconds. The video showed him seated calmly, Claire standing over him. Her voice was sharp, his reply quiet and steady. Then it shifted to his impromptu speech, the cross visible between his fingers. He turned the phone face down. He disliked attention, always had. He wasn't a person seeking headlines or clicks. A deeper feeling resonated within him. It wasn't pride, nor was it fear. It was the weight of being observed. A few minutes passed, and the teenager from 22B approached him. "Hey," the boy said, slightly winded. "I'm getting off here. My layover is in KC. I just wanted to say thanks again for not reacting negatively." Elijah smiled. "You accomplished more than I did." "You spoke the truth," the kid laughed. "No, man, you experienced it. I simply captured it on video." He extended his hand. "I'm Tyrell, by the way." "Elijah," they responded, shaking hands. The boy departed, his phone still in his hand, now with a more upright posture. Elijah reclined and rubbed his eyes. The day's burden began to weigh heavily on him. Immediately, his phone vibrated, displaying a message from his assistant. The church board viewed the video. They requested he address the matter on Sunday. Discussions about it were widespread. He rested his head against the terminal window. Outside, a plane was ascending. The engines created a powerful roar. The sun had descended just enough to illuminate the wings in gold. This was not what he had envisioned. He had come seeking tranquility and found himself amidst turmoil. Yet, perhaps storms were not always intended to be averted. For sometimes, the most profound teachings begin well before the formal setting and resonate far beyond the conclusion of a journey. Sunday morning arrived sooner than Elijah anticipated. He stood behind the pulpit at Grace Fellowship in Durham, the same location where he'd delivered sermons almost every week for the preceding 18 years. However, this time, the atmosphere felt altered. The seating was more densely filled. Unfamiliar faces occupied the pews, some from different churches, and others seemingly from nowhere. Phones were already capturing video before he began speaking. He chose not to start with scripture this time. He advanced, set his notes to the side, and surveyed the audience. "Most of you viewed the video," he started. "Some of you shared it, while others placed calls. Some expressed anger. Some inquired why I didn't shout, why I didn't call her out, why I didn't fight back." He paused, allowing the atmosphere to become still. "I've considered that as well. I've been reflecting on it consistently since." There were no microphone issues, no sounds of discomfort, just a quiet stillness. I remained composed on that plane, not from a place of fragility or fear, but because I've experienced enough to understand that the most prominent voice isn't always the most powerful. Occasionally, fortitude lies in remaining still when every instinct urges action. Occasionally, it's about declining with composure rather than anger, heads affirmed throughout the sanctuary. I didn't display that cross to instigate anyone. I wore it because it serves as a reminder of my identity. And when someone asks you to conceal the very essence that formed you, you are presented with two options: suppress your being to ease others, or remain steadfast and allow the resulting unease to reside with another. He glanced across the first row. Terrell was present beside Elijah's assistant. He offered a slight smile. The incident on that flight affected everyone. It highlighted how frequently we are instructed to be less assertive, quieter, and more accommodating. However, the reality is that one's beliefs, personal narrative, and cultural background are not liabilities. They are not something to be regretted, nor are they expendable. He touched the small wooden cross he wore and lifted it with care. "My grandmother gifted me this not for its appearance, but for its enduring significance. She told me, they'll try to take your voice. Don't hand them your silence, too." A low murmur ran through the crowd. Grief, pride, recognition. He took a deep breath. "I don't hate the woman from a plane. I'm not angry, but I hope she saw something that day that challenged her. And I hope we all remember, just because the world can't carry your truth doesn't mean you need to hide it." He stepped back. The congregation stood without prompting. It wasn't applause. It wasn't noise. A palpable sense of unity arose, as if a profound understanding transcended mere words. Following the service, Elijah emerged into the fresh spring air. Individuals approached him, extending handshakes, embraces, and cards. Some were visibly moved to tears. One woman gently placed her hand on his shoulder and quietly said, "You gave me permission to stop hiding." By that evening, the video had garnered 3.2 million views. Media organizations began contacting him, requesting interviews and soliciting editorials. But Elijah remained focused on his local community. His inbox remained full, yet his hand continued its work, visiting a family in the hospital, organizing food for the shelter, and completing the next week's sermon. The cross never left his neck, and for each story that arrived concerning someone standing up, speaking out, or simply choosing not to shrink, he'd whisper a quiet prayer. Not for praise, but for courage. The kind that doesn't roar, just the kind that remains. Because real change doesn't always begin with a protest or a headline. It begins with one person choosing to remain present. And if this story resonated with you, please don't simply move on, but share it, discuss it. And always remember to remain true to yourself, even when it's simpler to conform. He entered the bank, his appearance marked by a tattered coat and old shoes. People assumed he was simply another person experiencing homelessness. Then he spoke calmly, stating, "I own the land this building sits on," and presented documentation to support his claim. The door chimes sounded as it always did upon entry, yet few people acknowledged it. They barely glanced up. A few fleeting looks were all it received. One woman subtly shifted her position to observe him before returning to her computer screen. Another took a sip of her coffee and rolled her eyes, murmuring something to the teller beside her. A man entering the space appeared out of sync with the surroundings, not threatening, simply different. The environment consisted of shiny glass, polished tile, and Bluetooth headsets visible behind the counters. This was Morris Coltrane Langston, age 62, with a thick gray beard. His coat was 2 sizes too large, and his jeans suggested a past no one wished to explore. He moved deliberately, not due to age, but with caution. Each step felt significant, as if he were assessing his place within the setting. He approached the counter where Brittany was working. She offered him a brief look. "Sir, a bank card or ID is required for withdrawals," she stated plainly. Morris offered a gentle smile, though it seemed weary. "I don't require a withdrawal. I need to discuss property," he said. Brittany's eyes widened slightly. She glanced at her colleague, who was visibly trying to contain laughter. "Property?" she asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "I believe I own the land this bank is built on." At that moment, the laughter erupted. The message originated from Cliff Yarrow, the assistant branch manager, who had approached, arms crossed. Cliff was a man who displayed his authority prominently. He made no attempt to conceal his amusement. "Sir, I believe you are at the incorrect building," Cliff stated. "This is not the county records office. You cannot simply enter and declare ownership of a bank." "I did not say I own the bank," Maurice responded, his voice quiet. "I said I own the land. There's a distinction." Now, all eyes were upon him. The security guard, identified as Lee, who typically appeared to be checking his phone near the door, stood up straighter and moved forward. Cliff questioned, "Do you have any paperwork to back that up?" Maurice slowly reached into his coat pocket. For a moment, Lee reacted, conditioned by experience to anticipate a potential threat when a black man reached into a pocket. However, Morris's movements were unhurried and non-threatening. He carried the envelope deliberately, as if accustomed to it. He produced a thick, crumpled packet. The pages were yellowed with worn edges, having been folded and unfolded numerous times. At the top, it read, "Franklin Delroy, 1913 land deed." Below that were stamped legal seals and notary signatures. "I've held on to this since my father passed," I said. "And he kept it since his father passed," Maurice added. The deed belonged to a black-owned cooperative that obtained plots throughout this section of Knoxville during the Reconstruction era. I tapped the envelope gently. "This confirms my grandfather did not sell the land. It was leased. Ownership returned to us following a default, though this information was never shared." Brittany's smirk disappeared. Lee stopped scrolling. Cliff cleared his throat. "I believe it's time for you to leave, sir," he stated. "I think it's time someone examines the contents," Maurice said calmly. Then, an unexpected event occurred. A man from the office furthest to the left, John Delgado, the branch manager, emerged. He had been observing through the glass for the preceding few minutes. He requested the documents. Morris provided them immediately. John escorted them back to his office. A period of silence followed, lasting briefly. Subsequently, 5 minutes elapsed, then 10. Eventually, John appeared. His expression was altered. "Connect me with regional compliance on the line." Immediately, he stated. As phones began to ring and conversations grew concerned, Maurice remained still at his position by the counter. He was anticipating something, and they all understood, instinctively, that it wasn't a monetary request. Cliff walked back and forth behind the teller row, massaging the back of his neck, as if that would aid his comprehension of what he's heard. John Delgado continued on the phone, speaking in brief, strained sentences to someone at corporate. His office blinds were partially closed, but every few seconds, a glimpse of his face emerged from the gap. He wasn't smiling anymore. Brittany stood uncomfortably at her station, looking sideways at Maurice, who hadn't moved from his position. His hands were folded, and documents rested gently on the counter in front of him. "Do you want to sit down?" she finally asked, her voice softer. Maurice shook his head. "I've done enough sitting in my life." A man in a tailored suit and thick-rimmed glasses walked in briskly from a back entrance. His ID badge read Gerald Tisdale, Regional Property and Compliance. He went straight to Delgado's office without a word. Moments later, John opened the door again and waved for Maurice. "Sir, would you mind stepping in for a moment?" Maurice nodded once and retrieved his envelope. His boots made a slight scuffing sound against the tile as he entered the office. As the door closed behind him, the remaining staff members quieted. No one spoke. Even the security guard adjusted his position, uncertain whether to remain nearby or act as if nothing was occurring. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. "Mr. Langston," Gerald stated cautiously, "I've reviewed the original deed and the tax history you provided. Could you please tell us where you've been keeping these documents?" "My father kept it in a box of his belongings," Maurice responded. "He was a carpenter, building houses in Alcoa and Maryville before his knees failed. After he passed away, I kept the papers in a locker at a storage unit I used when I lacked permanent housing." Delgado appeared astonished. "You're saying this land was never sold? That the trust was still active?" Maurice retrieved a smaller, more recent envelope and gave it to Gerald. Inside was a typed letter from a small firm in Chattanooga, a probate specialist named Lena Fry, confirming the lapse in city filings and the reversion clause in the original agreement. The letter was dated 6 months ago. I only found it after she assisted me in reviewing some of my dad's old files. "Thought it was junk at first," Gerald said, staring at the paper. His mouth opened a little, but he didn't speak. "Legally," Maurice explained, "this building stood on land that was part of my grandfather's estate. The lease agreement had been temporary. As the bank underwent mergers and changes in ownership over the years, the arrangement wasn't renewed. They simply built on the land, presuming no one would inquire." Delgado rubbed his temple. "That represented decades of transactions," Maurice stated, "and not a single one examined the records far enough back. Everyone seemed to think the past had resolved itself." Gerald rose quickly and gazed out the office window. "We need to involve legal right away," he stated. "Already done," John responded quietly. A voice drifted from outside the office, speaking too loudly. Why would a homeless man return for this now? What would he possibly do with a piece of land beneath a bank? Inside, Maurice noticed. He glanced towards the window, then resumed looking at Gerald. "I didn't come for money," he said. "I came seeking the truth, and perhaps a measure of respect." Gerald turned, finally meeting my eyes. There was a pause. "You are not wrong, but while discussions focused on compliance and liability, something else was unfolding in the lobby. Whispers had escalated to murmurs, and one employee was already texting someone outside the bank. The story, as it turns out, began long before Maurice ever entered that bank. Prior to the advent of smartphones, before suburban expansion consumed agricultural land, before the concept of a man like Maurice could be envisioned, standing serenely with a document, contesting the very core of a multi-million-dollar organization. In 1913, Franklin Delroy, Morris's grandfather, was 23 years old and already recognized within Blount County for his skilled workmanship. His hands constructed churches, schoolhouses, and porches that remained standing a century later. Unbeknownst to many, Franklin was also a member of a discreet, close-knit group of black tradesmen, farmers, and ministers who combined their resources to purchase land. The purpose wasn't financial gain, but a matter of dignity. They identified as the East Blount Land Cooperative, and throughout the years, they obtained small plots on the periphery of what was then essentially cow pasture. However, Franklin, ever the visionary, included a specific provision in his deed. Should the land ever undergo development, leasing, or claimed by another party without a sale, ownership would return to his descendants after a specified duration. In 1927, a lumber company made a payment to lease the land for a limited time. Subsequently, a warehouse was constructed, followed by a small credit union. By the 1970s, that credit union had transformed into a regional bank. And when it was acquired again in 2003, all of the original documents were misplaced, overlooked, or lost within the new ownership. The Delroy family was never notified. Franklin was gone by that point. Morris's father, Jasper Langston, attempted to preserve the family's history. However, circumstances grew difficult. Employment opportunities disappeared, and Jasper began drinking. The traditional stories evolved into mere bedtime stories, losing any sense of verifiable truth. Morris recalled sitting on the porch in his youth, listening to his dad describe the plot by the rail tracks that Granddaddy owned. Yet, it held little significance for him. The stories remained just that, stories, until he matured and understood how families like his were frequently excluded from their own history. In 2020, when COVID caused widespread closures and Morris was residing in a church basement in Sevierville, he finally sorted through the last of his father's possessions. Among them, he discovered the original deed carefully wrapped in wax paper, and within it, a small note written in his dad's handwriting. "If you find this, don't let him tell you we didn't leave anything behind." Morris took that note with great importance. He dedicated months to research at the public library. He made trips to the county clerk's office. He consulted with Lena Fry, the probate attorney who remained professional when he shared the story with her. She located the land records and carefully compared parcel numbers, and she verified his findings. The land, now valued at millions, had been leased, not sold. The original clause remained in effect. No legal purchase had ever occurred. Consequently, after years of homelessness, this situation seems quite unusual. Morris entered the building constructed upon his grandfather's land and stated something unexpected. "I believe this belongs to me." At the bank, John Delgado now had the documents spread across his desk. They contained a century's worth of signatures, carbon copies, and ink stamps from courthouses that no longer existed. Gerald, the regional compliance officer, examined one page as if it had committed a personal offense. According to this clause, he stated, "The property returns to the original family if the lease expires without renewal or sale." John confirmed this had occurred twice, and the family was not notified. "That's correct." A significant silence followed. Then Gerald quietly expressed concern, saying, "We're in trouble." Maurice remained seated opposite them, silent. He showed no sign of a smile. However, a sense of calm was evident on his face. It was as if a man had, at long last, joined together all the pieces of a puzzle and possessed the perseverance to complete it. As events aligned within that office, a woman on her lunch break began live streaming the growing disturbance outside the bank. The unfolding situation quickly transcended their internal narrative. The lobby's ambience underwent a change. Initial silent assessment evolved into quiet wonder. The atmosphere then became something different altogether, a palpable sense of nervous anticipation. A teller had moved away from her workspace and was positioned by the coffee machine, appearing to stir sugar while observing the office door as if expecting someone to enter. The security guard had repositioned himself, now standing nearer to Morris's chair, seemingly not for protection, but perhaps to observe. Beyond the glass partitions, John Delgado's office was full. Gerald Tisdale was participating in a video conference with a group of legal representatives from corporate, their faces difficult to interpret. A senior counsel, Mark Levin, repeatedly posed the same inquiry. How did this oversight occur? No one could provide a satisfactory explanation. The numerous transfers of ownership involving various parent companies and banks had obscured the documentation until Morris brought it back to their attention. There's a public title gap, Gerald stated. No signed release, no recorded sale. The reversion clause was never satisfied. Mark Levin moved closer to the screen. Does this man, Langston, possess the original documents? John stated that he has more than just documents. He has lineage, and we verified the parcel data. It's the same land. The only alterations were the asphalt and steel constructed upon it. Mark pinched his nose. Okay, here's what we need. Secure a release from this man. Offer a small settlement. Remove him from the building before the press arrives. Maurice, seated quietly nearby, understood their thinking without needing to hear the discussion. He understood the atmosphere. After decades of observing how people assess your value, John ended the call and turned to him. Mr. Langston, would you be willing to settle this today? We could quietly arrange compensation, something equitable. Morris folded his arms. What's fair to you? John paused. That would require negotiation. But if we act quickly, we could avoid unwanted publicity. Maurice chuckled softly. Unwanted by whom? John momentarily looked surprised. A knock sounded at the glass door. A woman, identifiable by the local news logo on her lanyard, smiled and raised her phone. Hello. We've received information that someone entered with a land deed asserting ownership of the bank property. May we speak with Mr. Langston? John's face visibly drained. Who informed you? A voice from the lobby murmured. The live streams have exceeded 12,000 viewers. Morris rose to his feet deliberately. There's nothing to be concerned about. I'm not intending to cause a disturbance. Gerald approached. Mr. Langston, please understand that this situation requires careful handling. It would benefit everyone involved if we could maintain discretion. I attempted a subtle approach, Maurice stated. I'm accustomed to quiet. It defined much of my existence. It yielded no progress. A pause settled over the group. Gerald seemed poised to object, but a palpable truth lingered, inescapable. Returning to the lobby, Brittany spoke softly to Maurice. The amusement had vanished from her face. Do you truly possess this? She inquired. I have always possessed it, he replied. The recollection seemed to simply vanish. She lowered her gaze, a hint of embarrassment visible. I'm sorry. Morris's expression eased a little. It's not your fault. You were instructed on how to behave when someone like me enters. The bank's doors opened once more, and 2 additional reporters entered. A man carried a boom microphone over his shoulder. Another began recording with his phone. Cliff attempted to block their entry. This is private property. A reporter responded, observing Maurice. Not for long. As inquiries began from the media, Maurice did not seek attention. He instead glanced back at the familiar envelope he held, the one that held his family's history across generations, and understood it was time for the world to know it. Maurice needed no microphone. He needed no formal announcement. He simply needed to remain where he was. That was sufficient. A reporter, a woman in her 40s named Kimber Rowland from WBR, approached. Mr. Langston, could you verify that you assert ownership of the land the bank occupies? Maurice met her gaze, unwavering. I'm not asserting anything, he stated. I'm presenting facts, and the document in my hand demonstrates what none of you ever took the time to investigate. Kimber nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the significance in his tone. What outcome are you pursuing with this? Maurice didn't respond immediately. He turned to address the increasingly large gathering. There were customers, employees, and security present, with some people watching from the sidewalk. What I'm hoping for, he said finally, is that the next time someone walks in looking like I do, maybe people won't react with amusement first. The silence that followed was palpable. The young man who had been laughing earlier near the coffee machine suddenly looked down at his shoes. Brittany tightened her grip on her ID badge and avoided his gaze. Cliff shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. Look, Sir, I didn't mean any disrespect. You need to comprehend. We simply weren't prepared. There was laughter. Maurice intervened. You all responded that way. The moment I entered the room, you observed my coat, my shoes, the discoloration on my hands, and you determined I was insignificant. No one spoke. Have you ever considered how many people you're likely to dismiss each day? Moving around here as if you possess all the knowledge, as if you've already assessed someone's narrative merely by viewing their exterior. John Delgado moved ahead, attempting to redirect the situation. Mr. Langston, we are ready to offer a formal apology and begin settlement negotiations. Maurice gave him a drawn-out, weary look. Do you still believe this concerns finances? A teenager with a camera phone murmured to his friend, out of view of the reporters, Dude, this person is really committed. Observe the documents. Kimber, perceiving something more significant, inquired, Where have you been until now? What prompted you to come forward at this time? Maurice sighed, not in annoyance, simply in contemplation. Following my dad's passing, I lost interest in matters of this nature. I was preoccupied with basic survival, taking on sporadic jobs like roofing, welding, and janitorial work whenever available. Maintaining stable housing proved difficult when people avoided direct interaction. I experienced periods of both prosperity and hardship, followed by even more challenging times. He paused. There were nights I slept under bridges and mornings I cleaned the same floors people used to ignore me. However, I never discarded that envelope. The memory of every shelter I stayed in, every town I passed through, remained with me. He held it up gently. It's all I had left from a man who believed we were worth more than people thought. And one day, I simply grew weary of silence. A woman from the crowd spoke softly. You kept the deed all these years? Maurice nodded. 50 years it stayed in our family. Passed from one calloused hand to another, Kimber asked. And what now? He surveyed the bank lobby, his gaze lingering on each employee who had assessed him that morning. What now? He repeated. Now you recall my name. From a corner location, Gerald spoke to John. This is going to be a public relations disaster. However, the individuals within the bank weren't observing Gerald. They were observing Maurice. Truly observing. Some for the first time, as if a barrier had been removed. Not just from his narrative, but from theirs as well. You believe I was unseen? Maurice stated softly. I remained present. You simply didn't observe carefully enough. However, the outside world had already begun to notice. They perceived a man who brought more than just a deed to that building. He carried evidence that dignity isn't derived from affluence. It arises from steadfastly maintaining one's identity. By the following morning, the narrative had spread beyond state lines. Every local news station in Tennessee aired a rendition of it. Some reported inaccuracies. A report suggested Maurice had assumed control of the bank, a claim that proved false. Nevertheless, the message spread. Residents of Blount County, particularly older individuals, began searching through attics and storage boxes, questioning what they might have overlooked. College students shared excerpts online with accompanying text, such as this exemplifies generational theft. To them, Maurice wasn't a news item. He represented an alert and a sign. At the bank, the situation quickly worsened. Legal representatives from the corporation arrived from elsewhere. Security personnel were now joined by local police officers patrolling the parking lot, employed for crowd management. Demonstrators had assembled along the sidewalk, displaying cardboard signs. Their messages included phrases like respect land rights. Not just a deed, a legacy. He was right all along. Maurice hadn't organized the gathering, nor had he requested anyone to attend, yet they came. Inside the building, the atmosphere was tense. Gerald Tisdale was pacing once more, his face flushed as he managed calls from corporate and press liaisons. John Delgado was in his office, with the blinds completely shut, feeling the burden of everything. Maurice was in the break room, drinking coffee from paper cup. Never thought I'd be allowed in here, he remarked, mostly to himself. Kimber Rowland had returned, and her camera crew was filming quietly from the parking lot. She wasn't trying to create problems. She was simply waiting for the story to unfold. That afternoon, a legal representative, Clay Addison, entered the bank. He possessed a clean-shaven appearance, a southern drawl, and wore a silk tie that appeared more valuable than Morris's entire wardrobe. He did not offer a smile. "Mr. Langston," Clay began, settling across from him, "let me start by saying our firm recognizes the validity of your documentation. We are here to discuss terms." Maurice listened intently, remaining still. "You've placed our client in a complex situation. We acknowledge the oversight and are ready to present a substantial financial offer for the permanent transfer of ownership." A paper was slid across the table by Clay. Maurice looked at it, then raised his gaze. "You believe this is the core issue?" he inquired, his voice level. "It's a considerable sum," Clay stated. "It's a price," Maurice replied, "and it doesn't come close to covering what you're attempting to resolve." Clay released a sharp breath. "What would be acceptable to you?" Maurice leaned forward, composed but resolute. "I want a plaque with my grandfather's name displayed out front. I also want the official record corrected with the city, and I want a foundation established in his name, one that provides housing for families who have experienced similar circumstances." Clay blinked. "Are you serious?" "I'm absolutely serious." There was a significant pause. Then Clay said, "I will present this to the board." "You please do that." Information about the negotiation became public the same day. And when it did, an unforeseen development occurred. People began making donations. People donated online, in person, and by check. One woman from Jackson traveled 2 hours to personally hand Maurice a $20 bill and express her gratitude for him, ensuring they weren't forgotten. The bank subsequently released a brief statement later that week, stating, "We recognize the validity of Mr. Maurice Langston's claim and are working in good faith to resolve this matter respectfully. We have deep appreciation for the legacy of Franklin Delroy and the community he helped build." While corporate and sanitized, this statement was unexpected. Regarding Maurice, there was no celebration. No press conference was held. He simply exited the bank one afternoon, carrying the same envelope he had entered with. However, this time he wasn't alone. 3 generations of Delroys stood with him in spirit, and hundreds more supported them. While legal teams assessed expenses and public relations teams prepared announcements, the most important aspect had already transpired. Someone like Maurice had finally been acknowledged, and the narrative was no longer controlled by the bank. It belonged to everyone who had ever been forgotten. The sun shone that morning. Maurice Langston stood in front of the bank again. Now, he wasn't standing on disputed land. He was standing on his grandfather's land, officially recognized by the city of Knoxville as part of the Franklin Delroy Legacy Trust. It wasn't just a name on paper anymore. A new plaque had been installed outside the bank's main entrance, embedded in a small brick pedestal near the sidewalk. Bronze letters, clear and lasting. Dedicated to Franklin Delroy, 1890 to 1954, builder, father, landowner. His legacy endures. Maurice touched it softly. The plaque felt cool beneath his fingertips. He remained silent. Words weren't necessary. A small group had assembled for the unveiling. Community leaders, students from the local university, reporters, and some of the same bank staff who previously ridiculed him were present. Brittany stood at the rear, her hands clasped, attempting to make eye contact with Maurice whenever he turned. This time he succeeded. The foundation he had proposed was already being established. A partnership with a local nonprofit was formed within weeks of the settlement. The Delroy Housing Fund would provide grants to families at risk of homelessness, particularly those who have been disadvantaged by legal complexities and overlooked actions. "I didn't desire revenge," Maurice told Kimber Rowland in his final interview. "I simply wanted the truth to endure beyond the falsehood." It had taken years to reach this point. For years, he had experienced being overlooked, marginalized, and disregarded. However, the instant he entered through those glass doors, holding a creased envelope and a legacy of suffering, things began to shift. And currently, he was simply a man identified by a name. He had acquired a modest, well-kept house not distant from the outskirts of Alcoa, close to the same areas where his father had previously constructed porches and fences. It wasn't elaborate, merely a neat area, a functional sink, a bed to relax in. Occasionally, he would sit on a plastic chair outside, sipping coffee and greeting children cycling up the slope. On other occasions, he collaborated with local high schools, discussing land ownership, family histories, and the consequences of oblivion with students. Preserve your documents, he advised them. Retain your names. Ensuring no one erases your people from the narrative. People now referred to him as Mr. Langston. At times, even Sir, but the designation he valued most was the one his grandfather had attained. Builder. It wasn't about buildings, but about something larger. Legacy. He never anticipated forgiveness from the bank. However, it wasn't necessary. What he required, he received: an acknowledgement, a correction, and the opportunity for those who followed to declare, "I belong here too." The bank continued its operations, but the employees carried themselves differently. They engaged with people they had previously overlooked. They posed questions rather than making assumptions. The transformation wasn't flawless, but it represented a meaningful shift. One afternoon, several months following the resolution of events, Brittany approached him outside the community center. "Mr. Langston?" she asked, her voice betraying nervousness. "Yes," he replied. I've been taking night classes. Real estate law." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" he inquired. "After everything that happened, I realized how much I didn't know. About ownership, history, how things get passed down or lost." Morris smiled, slow and genuine. "Good for you." She paused. "I'm sorry for how I treated you that first day." He nodded. An apology wasn't necessary. It was owed to the individual who would next enter. She considered this thoughtfully, responding, "Yes, I will." He retrieved a copy of the original deed, a replica, to be exact, from his coat and gave it to her. "Keep this. Use it in class. Teach someone something." She accepted it with care, as if it were fragile. As she departed, Morris looked towards the street and observed a group of teenagers assembling at the bus stop across the road. One of them gestured towards the plaque. The others drew closer to listen. He remained silent, allowing them to continue. He simply observed, a quiet sense of pride welling up within him, as his grandfather's name emerged in the discussion once more. Perhaps that's how genuine transformation truly begins. Not through rage, nor solely through the pursuit of justice, but through remembrance and the bravery to keep it alive. Should you experience a feeling while hearing Morris's narrative, do not hold it back. Spread it. Discuss it. And if there's a family name you haven't mentioned in some time, vocalize it. The impact of legacies endures only when we actively preserve them. Subscribe for more stories that illuminate the true meaning of dignity. Marlene Daniels paid for her first-class seat in full. However, when she was discreetly requested to move to the rear of the aircraft, she did not cause a disturbance. The remaining passengers did, and social media quickly followed suit. Marlene Daniels was not a woman who desired much. She had never been. This was true when she dedicated 32 years to Birmingham Public Schools and remained true when she raised 3 children on a teacher's salary following her husband's passing. She was reliable. She was resilient. At the age of 72, she had finally learned to do something she'd often advised others to do: take up space. This was the reason she purchased the ticket. Her granddaughter, Alia, was graduating from Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Alia was the first in the family to earn a degree in environmental engineering. It was a significant occasion, and Marlene, she planned to attend, positioned prominently, dressed in her best Sunday clothes, and cheering as she once did at those high school basketball games. She had flown previously, certainly, but always in coach. Always quiet, always practical. This time, however, she reserved a first-class seat. She paid in full. She selected her spot by the window. It wasn't about luxury. It was about presence. It was her way of stating, "I'm still here. I'm present." Walking through the gate at Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport, she appeared like someone who knew who she was. She wore gray slacks, a pearl gray sweater, small gold earrings, and a leather handbag that bore the marks of years of careful use. Her hair, silver and neatly arranged, was styled in a low twist. A smile touched her lips as she greeted the gate agent. A smile offered not from obligation, but but from a genuine desire to be considerate, even when faced with unkindness. "Good morning, Miss Daniels," the agent said, scanning her ticket. She appreciated the formality. Miss Daniels. It still carried a certain dignity. As she entered the plane, several passengers in the front cabin briefly looked up. A few offered smiles. A man, appearing to be in his 40s, gave a courteous nod. Seated across the aisle, a younger woman wearing a denim jacket and chunky boots was reading a magazine. Marlene located her seat, 2A, and made herself comfortable. She carefully placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, adjusted her sweater, and gazed out the window. The sky was clear. That felt like a positive omen. Flight attendants moved along the aisle, arranging luggage and engaging in brief conversations. One offered her a water bottle. "First time in first class?" she asked, her smile seeming practiced. Marlene quietly laughed. "Is it that noticeable?" She responded. "You look wonderful," the attendant continued. "Just wanted to say welcome." Marlene nodded graciously and redirected her gaze toward the window, her thoughts drifting to Alia's smile and the swift passage of time. It felt like only yesterday she had been in the front office of Jefferson Middle, observing her granddaughter twirling in her chair while completing paperwork. She relaxed, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Everything appeared tranquil, orderly, and correct. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Excuse me, ma'am," a flight attendant stated, differing from the initial attendant. The attendant was young, blonde, with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Marlene looked up. "I'm so sorry, but there appears to have been a seat assignment mix-up. Please move to seat 19C. Marlene blinked, seeming to question if she's understood correctly. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" she asked. "There's been a change. A late passenger arrived. The system assigned you to this seat in error. We require this seat to be free." Marlene remained perfectly still. Her voice remained even, and her eyes didn't show any displeasure. She reached into a bag, retrieved the paper boarding pass she always printed, and displayed it. "This is my assigned seat, 2A. It was paid for and chosen by me." The attendant looked at it, then checked the aisle. "I understand. I truly do, but we're aiming to resolve this swiftly before takeoff." The woman in the denim jacket, seated across the aisle, lowered her magazine. She observed her sitting there prior to anyone else boarding. She stated softly. Marlene remained still. "Not yet." Her fingers rested on the chair arms, applying just enough pressure to keep her steady. "I'm not attempting to cause disruption," she said calmly, "but I reserved this seat months ago." The attendant leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Ma'am, if you could please cooperate, we'll get this sorted. We just need you to move for now." Then, without another word, a man appeared. Tall, white, neatly trimmed beard, dressed in business casual, holding a laptop bag, and looking impatient. The attendant gave a small, practiced smile. "Right this way, sir." But Marlene hadn't moved. Not yet. Marlene's fingers remained curled tight around the armrests. She detected the subtle sounds of passengers arranging themselves, zippers fastening, and safety belts securing. Yet the atmosphere surrounding her felt heavy, resistant to movement. The man now stood almost directly in front of her seat, looking down with an expression that was a blend of confusion and annoyance. "This is two-way, right?" he asked, looking towards the flight attendant, but not Marlene. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Just a minor misunderstanding. We are resolving it now." Marlene spoke with composure, but her voice conveyed firmness. "How is this addressed?" The attendant attempted to maintain a pleasant demeanor. "We simply require you to take seat 19C. It remains a satisfactory seat, and we will ensure you receive compensation for the disruption." "Disruption?" Marlene lifted her eyebrows. "Being asked to vacate the seat I paid for in front of a completely full plane after I'd already been seated? That is not a small matter." The man finally made eye contact with her. He did not speak, just gazed. And something about that silence, easy for him, unsettling for her, felt significant. "Ma'am," the flight attendant repeated, her voice now more assertive. "Please." Marlene glanced around. Silence filled the cabin, but eyes were fixed on her. The man seated across the aisle appeared uneasy, fidgeting in his seat. The younger woman with the magazine continued to stare. She didn't desire to create a disturbance. It had never been her way. She had always instructed her students to overcome embarrassment with grace, not noise. At this point, she questioned what she would be conveying if she were to leave unnoticed. However, her dignity couldn't sustain the entire journey. Marlene carefully released her seatbelt, retrieved her bag, and rose. The flight attendant sighed, clearly relieved. "Thank you," she stated, and moved to allow the man to take the seat, where he opened his laptop and straightened his tie as if it were a routine occurrence. Marlene held her back straight as she walked along the narrow aisle, passing rows of strangers who didn't meet her gaze. She arrived at row 19, located seat C, and put her bag under the seat without a word. The chair was smaller, situated nearer the restroom, noisy, confined, and not at all what she had anticipated. She settled in quietly, feeling a stinging in her eyes. A man seated across the row, a teenager wearing headphones, looked at her with a questioning expression. She gave him a weary smile. A weight settled in her chest, not from the seat itself, but from the lack of surprise. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that circumstances had changed. That at her age, following her considerable contributions to others, she wouldn't need to demonstrate her right to what she had purchased. She glanced down at her hands, noticing a slight tremor. Her wedding band remained on her finger, even after so many years. She had raised 3 children, 2 of whom were now professionals. She had dedicated her life to her students, writing letters to parents, staying late to tutor. She had broken up fights, buried students lost too soon, taught kids how to believe in themselves even when the world didn't. But here, on this plane, she was just someone to be moved out of the way. The captain came over the speaker, giving the usual welcome. Flight time to Indianapolis, 1 hour and 42 minutes. Seat backs upright, tray tables locked. Marlene leaned her head against the window. She remained silent, her gaze fixed. Then, a subtle change occurred. "Excuse me?" The voice came from the woman wearing a denim jacket, who had now risen to her feet. "Hello," she said, her tone clear enough for Rose to hear. "What transpired here doesn't feel right." Marlene turned, visibly surprised. The woman continued, gesturing towards the front. "That lady had her seat initially. I observed her checking in and taking her assigned seat. She presented a printed boarding pass. And you all moved her? What was the reason for that?" A moment of silence followed. Several passengers glanced upward, seemingly attentive. A flight attendant hurried over, attempting to soothe the woman. "I understand your concern, but we're trying to keep things moving," she said. "No," the woman responded, her voice rising. "You moved her because you believed she wouldn't speak out. But I will," and she wasn't alone anymore. The cabin, which had just moments before been filled with the quiet rustle of carry-ons and pre-flight conversation, was now utterly silent. Marlene remained still. She remained in 19C, uncertain whether to feel embarrassed or thankful. Perhaps both. She observed the woman, appearing to be in her mid-30s, with a confident posture and eyes filled with frustration, firmly holding her position. "I'm sorry," the woman continued, now speaking to everyone nearby. "But you can't ignore what just occurred. You moved that woman from her purchased seat, offering no reason. And this man," she indicated towards 2, simply walked in as if everything was normal. The gentleman in the seat glanced up briefly, adjusting his cufflinks. He remained silent. "Why?" the woman insisted. "And I want the rest of the plane to hear, because this isn't correct." The flight attendant paused. She began to speak, but then glanced around. Passengers were turning to look. Phones appeared. A red-haired teenager 2 rows back had his camera aimed directly forward, recording openly. A mother with a toddler leaned in and whispered to her husband. People's gazes were moving. Tension increased. Suddenly, a voice from row 3 interrupted. "She is correct." A man, appearing to be in his late 40s, with a beard streaked with gray and wearing a worn Detroit Tigers cap, rose partially from his seat. I observed it as well. She was already present, holding a boarding pass. You moved her without justification, and honestly, I am not satisfied with that. The flight crew exchanged looks. Another attendant, taller, older, possibly more experienced, approached, placing a hand lightly on the younger woman's arm. "We will be able to discuss this once we are airborne," he stated. The woman in denim remained still. "No, you speak now. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate action. And if no one else is going to voice it, I will." That woman was repositioned because you believed she wouldn't object due to her age. And let's be frank, because she is black. That word resonated like a sharp rebuke in the quiet. Marlene averted her eyes. She felt a flush rise up her neck. She had never enjoyed being the focus of attention. A voice arose from the rear of the cabin. "That's unfair," a younger man murmured. "There's no way that should have occurred." Another person then spoke, their voice raised. "Return her seat." The man wearing a two-way radio seemed uneasy and finally closed his laptop. He glanced at the flight crew. "Honestly, I don't need the seat if it's going to cause a disturbance," he stated. "I simply took the one they assigned to me." The assertive woman responded with a derisive laugh. "You observed her relocation and didn't inquire, not even once." He shrugged, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "It's not my responsibility." The flight attendant tried to manage the situation. "We recognize emotions are intense. Let's resolve this promptly so we can depart on time." However, the man wearing the tiger's cap interrupted. "Not until she receives her seat back." He turned and addressed Marlene. "Ma'am," he said, "would you like your seat back?" She paused. She had dedicated much of her life to instructing others on how to utilize their voice to champion what is just. Now her own trembled. "I don't want to be the cause of this flight being delayed," she stated quietly. "You are not," the woman from row 2 responded. "You are the reason it might finally be rectified." That was when it occurred. The man in row 4 rose, followed by a couple situated behind him. "If she doesn't receive her seat," someone declared, "we are not sitting either." Flight attendants began to panic. Someone reached for the phone to contact the pilot. The aircraft doors remained open, and established procedures were now being implemented. The chief flight attendant returned, visibly agitated. "We need to halt boarding," a fellow passenger interjected. "It's too late. The planes are full. Resolve this immediately." Marlene rose deliberately. Her hands were steady now. "I didn't request this situation," she stated. "However, I will not remain here and pretend I didn't receive what I paid for. I secured seat 2A. I checked in promptly. I adhered to every guideline. Throughout my life, I've adhered to every guideline." Then, suddenly, the man in 2A rose. He offered no apology. He avoided eye contact. He simply took his laptop and proceeded toward the rear of the plane. The crew swiftly assisted Marlene in returning to the front. As she passed, numerous passengers acknowledged her with nods. Several offered words of encouragement. "Good for you. You didn't deserve that." "We saw." She resumed her seat in 2A. The armrests felt altered this time. Not stiff, not cold. By the time the plane departed, the video had already been uploaded online. As the aircraft ascended through the clouds, the mood within the cabin remained subdued. Marlene was seated in 2A, her hands calmly resting in her lap. She had not consumed the offered beverage. It wasn't necessary. Her mind was occupied. She felt no anger, not a vocal expression of it. She was considering her granddaughter, reflecting on the world Alia was entering with that degree. This incident, this small public humiliation, wasn't unprecedented. However, something about it felt different this time. In row 18, a teenager with red hair had already posted a 23-second video to TikTok with a caption, "They move an old black woman out of her first-class seat for some dude." The entire plane seemed to agree. The reactions were immediate. "That's disgusting. She deserves to have that seat back. What's the airline? Tag them." By the time the flight landed in Indiana, 3 influencers had compiled a video that was distributed by an account called Justice from the Aisle, and it had already surpassed 80,000 views. Marlene was unaware of any of this. She was still arranging her sweater and getting ready to text Alia upon arriving at the terminal. Her phone had remained turned off throughout the flight. As passengers exited the aircraft, several briefly touched her arm. "You're a class act," they said. "Glad they made it right." She softly expressed her gratitude, her eyes appearing warm yet weary. She felt unsure how to react to the focus. A portion of her longed to retreat into the airport bustle, simply taking her shuttle and heading into town. However, upon activating her phone, it vibrated and vibrated again. Numerous messages arrived, some from her children, others from past colleagues, and even a few unfamiliar numbers. Her youngest son, Louis, had attempted to call her 3 times. She accepted the call on the 4th ring. "Mama," he said, his voice already filled with emotion. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, baby." "Why? You're all over the internet. I mean everywhere, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Someone has a video of you standing up for yourself. You handled that with grace, Mama. I'm proud of you." Marlene's chest tightened. I didn't even know she was filming. She captured everything. They attempted to displace you from a seat you paid for, and people are reacting strongly. She paused, taking a deep breath. "I didn't do anything extraordinary." "Yes, you did," Louis stated. By the time she reached the parking area where her shuttle was waiting, she had missed 5 additional calls. One was from a local reporter in Indiana. 2 were from media outlets she didn't recognize. Someone named Mia from the Morning Circle had emailed her twice already. Marlene lowered her phone into her lap, allowing the shuttle to rock slightly as it pulled away from the curb. A college-aged black woman with thick braids and a Purdue hoodie sat beside her. She looked at Marlene, paused briefly, then shifted in her seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began hesitantly. "Were you the woman on the plane today? The one in the video?" Marlene raised her eyebrows. "That fast?" The girl smiled. "People share things that are important, and this was important." Marlene paused. "It's odd. I didn't intend to be involved in something like this." The girl spoke softly, saying it hadn't been planned. However, she acknowledged that Marlene had managed the situation in a manner that resonated with many. Marlene returned a smile, then glanced out the window, observing the passing billboards and highway signs. She had simply intended to attend a graduation, and now the entire country was discussing the event. However, the airline remained silent, an unsettling silence. By the time Marlene arrived at her hotel in Lafayette, her name was already appearing in the subject lines of press releases. Unofficially, naturally, no company was willing to acknowledge anything that could incur a financial cost. However, the airline, Coastal Air, was aware of the situation. They had viewed the videos, read the online discussions, and hastily convened in private meetings. Marlene's phone rang again as she entered the elevator. An unfamiliar number. She allowed it to proceed to voicemail. She felt weary. She had traveled across 2 states, experienced humiliation, then received applause, and subsequently been drawn into a situation she hadn't requested. All she wanted now was a warm shower, a meal she didn't have to cook, and to see Ollie across that stage. Her room overlooked a small park where families walked dogs and students tossed frisbees. The sun was dipping behind the trees. Marlene watched for a moment before sitting down and turning on the TV. Local news was already on. The video, now exceeding 2.3 million views in under 12 hours, depicts what seems to be an elderly black woman being requested to relocate from her designated seat in the first-class cabin to make room for a younger white passenger. Other passengers on board stepped in, and the woman was ultimately returned to her original seat. She silenced the notification. Her phone vibrated again, a text from Louis. "Coastal Air has released a statement. It's underwhelming." She clicked the link. The official statement read, "We are aware of the incident on board Flight 482 today involving a seat assignment confusion. Coastal Air is committed to fair and inclusive treatment for all passengers and is reviewing internal procedures. We apologize for any inconvenience experienced." Inconvenience, she whispered, shaking her head. That word again. She remembered all the time she'd written real apologies in her career, when a teacher lost their temper, when a parent was left unheard. She avoided using that term, especially after incidents occurred. That evening, she accepted a phone call. Marlene Daniels? The voice was distinct and resolute. It belonged to a woman, professional in tone. "Yes, speaking. This was Nina Morgan. I'm a producer with Midday Matters. We're interested in having you on our show tomorrow morning, just to briefly discuss your experience. It won't be intrusive. You're seen as representing something larger, and people are paying attention. Marlene hesitated. I'm not a symbol, she replied. I know, Nina responded, her voice gentle and sincere. That's why her refusal of the interview felt significant, at least for the time being. A quiet impulse arose within her. She had dedicated her life to assisting others in expressing themselves. Perhaps now was her opportunity to speak out once more. The following morning, she composed a handwritten note. It was brief, a single page in length, but each word was carefully chosen. She began with the sentence, I wasn't trying to go viral. I attempted to see my granddaughter. She spoke about dignity, about how simple it is to overlook older individuals, about what it feels like to be marginalized, not for the first time, but for the thousandth. And she concluded with this. I spent decades telling young people they were important, that their presence was important, that they belonged. I still believe that. But sometimes the ones who forget are not the students. It's the people who think they're in charge. She entrusted the letter to Lewis, who shared it on his social media with her consent. Within hours, by lunchtime, it had accumulated over 400,000 shares. Her story appeared on talk shows. An op-ed piece in the Indianapolis Journal commended her composure. Civil rights advocates incorporated her letter into speeches and public events. A particular comment resonated with her. It originated from a woman named Danielle in Topeka. My mother experienced a time when she was pushed out of a bank queue and dismissed it with a laugh. She stated, people like us don't make noise. I wish she could have witnessed this. Ms. Daniels, thank you. Your words helped me remember not to dismiss things so easily. Marlene was seated near the window, holding her phone and a letter. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't protested. She hadn't created a video. She simply stated the facts. However, the crucial moment she awaited hadn't arrived. It was pending on a campus stage. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. Marlene hadn't slept well. Amidst the news reports, the communications, and the sensation of being observed by countless unseen individuals, finding peace had been challenging. Yet, her steps were firm as she entered the campus of Purdue University, her focus resolute. She wore a navy blue dress and a coordinating hat, the very one she'd reserved for a significant occasion. This was that occasion. She was unconcerned if people recognized her now. Let them. Today was not about her. She was there to witness her granddaughter's walk. The stadium seating was almost completely full when she located her row. A security guard approached her, held her gaze for a moment, then smiled. Ms. Daniels, yes? He said, I just wanted to say thank you. I saw the video. I'm glad you stood your ground. She nodded warmly. Appreciate that. I'm here for my granddaughter. He reached into his pocket and continued. The dean of students asked me to escort you to a reserved section. For family. It has a better view. Marlene paused, questioning, reserved for whom? He smiled. For you. She followed him upwards to the front rows, just behind the stage, where a simple seat was designated with a folded card. Mrs. Marlene Daniels. Guest of honor. She blinked, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a spotlight. There was no podium, just a seat, and it belonged to her. Offered, not taken. Shortly, the ceremony commenced. Names were announced. Gowns flowed. Applause resounded. Then, Alia Denise Daniels. The name resonated through the air like a church bell. Marlene watched as her granddaughter advanced. Tall, radiant, her eyes gleaming under the weight of her own accomplishment. She saw her grandmother, and for a split second that proud smile wavered, only to return, fuller, brighter, and glistening with tears. Following the ceremony, the family assembled beneath a cluster of trees near the quad. Her sons were already debating who was taking whom to dinner. Her daughter-in-law was adjusting her youngest shirt. Alia hurried to her and embraced her grandmother's waist, almost dislodging the hat. You made it, she murmured. Naturally I did. Marlene responded. Do you imagine a seating error would prevent me? They laughed, lingering in the embrace. Alia retreated, her eyes glistening. I witnessed everything, Grandma. The videos, the letter. I'm receiving messages from students at school, professors, classmates, individuals I don't even know. You've instigated conversations. I didn't attempt to, Marlene stated. I simply didn't want to remain silent anymore. Alia concurred. Perhaps we don't always have to raise our voices. But when we do speak, people should pay attention. Later that afternoon, while gathering her belongings back at the hotel, Marlene received a formal letter slid under her door. It bore the Coastal Air logo in an embossed design. The letter contained an offer, an invitation to speak at their annual Equity and Training Summit, with all expenses covered. They described it as an opportunity to elevate the discussion. She read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her purse. The next day, she called the number provided. "Ms. Daniels, we're honored you returned our call," said a representative. "We'd love for you to be our guest speaker. Your story, your grace, has moved thousands." "I'm flattered," Marlene said plainly, "but I won't be attending." The woman on the other end paused. "May I ask why?" Marlene responded, "I wasn't moved to speak for your company. I spoke because my dignity fell out of place in row 19. She concluded the call softly and settled onto the bed's edge, observing a small group of children playing in the park across the street. The wind swirled leaves in lazy circles. She didn't require a public forum. She had already conveyed her message, and it was apparent without explicit statement. This time, the seat wasn't withheld from her. It was presented. She simply declined to occupy it. However, there was one final matter she needed to address. The information wasn't shared with the airline, nor with reporters. It was for all of us. The morning she flew back home, Marlene sat quietly by the airport window, observing the activity on the tarmac. Luggage carts, fuel trucks, a slow taxiing plane with its belly full of untold stories. She sipped coffee from paper cup, her hands now steady. The commotion had subsided. News cycles had moved on. Trending topics had displaced her face with fresh headlines. And that was acceptable. Marlene's actions weren't motivated by a desire for attention. They stemmed from an internal resistance to diminishing. Her phone vibrated again. It was another message from an unknown sender, a retired nurse in Arizona. The message read, "I've spent my whole life apologizing before I even spoke. Thank you for reminding me I don't have to." Marlene reread the message, then put her phone away and surveyed the terminal. People passed by her, pulling carry-on bags, enjoying lattes, and holding onto their children's hands. Most didn't recognize her. She wore her usual gray sweater and pearl earrings, nothing extravagant. Yet, if one observed carefully, there was a certain quality to her demeanor, a quiet strength that surpassed mere physical bearing. She recalled the many years she had dedicated to assuring her students they mattered, instilling in young black girls the importance of carrying themselves with confidence, articulating their thoughts with precision, and refusing to allow others to diminish their worth. She believed she had concluded imparting this guidance upon her retirement. She was mistaken. Self-respect is inherent. It isn't acquired through achievement or dependent on positions, designations, or connections. It isn't bestowed by unfamiliar individuals, and it cannot be compromised when circumstances deem it problematic for another. It is rightfully yours, regardless of whether others acknowledge it. That was the core principle. It resonated not only with those who observed her movement down the plane aisle, but with the reserved individuals. Those who suppressed their dignity countless times in checkout lines, boardrooms, waiting rooms. Those who've been subtly indicated to relinquish their seat, either physically or figuratively, to someone deemed more significant. Marlene's story wasn't concerning revenge. It wasn't reflecting anger. It wasn't even focused on that man or that airline. The memory centered on the decision she made, resolving that she wouldn't remain silent for anyone. Just before her flight was scheduled to board, she rose and stretched. A young girl close by gently pulled on her mother's sleeve and murmured, "That's the lady from the video." Marlene offered a slight smile. It wasn't a broad smile, nor one seeking acknowledgement. It was the type of smile that conveyed, "I am aware of my identity." As she proceeded toward the gate, the same flight attendant from her initial journey appeared, though in a different uniform on a different day. The woman looked up, a flash of recognition in her eyes. She offered a brief nod. Marlene stated simply, good morning. Nothing more. Nothing less. A lengthy explanation wasn't necessary. Applause wasn't required. She possessed something more valuable. Serenity. As the gate opened and boarding commenced, Marlene didn't hurry. She waited patiently. She proceeded deliberately, and, upon reaching her row, yes, first class once more, she positioned her bag under the seat, took a seat, and gazed out the window. The sky stretched endlessly. She remained silent for the entire flight because she felt no need to speak. Occasionally, the most impactful declaration is simply holding your place, particularly when others anticipate you to relinquish it. Therefore, if you're hearing this and you've ever felt diminished for asserting yourself, recall Marlene Daniels. Not because she became widely known online, but because she never increased her volume, and yet everyone understood her. If this narrative resonated with you, please share it. Speak when you are able. Remain in your seat when required. And most importantly, never allow another person to determine when your dignity is present.